Real Stories Tapes True Crime is your new true crime podcast fix. In our first season, we'll explore suspicious deaths at a California hospital and a skydiver landing dead on a suburban driveway with a bag containing guns, drugs, and night vision goggles. To join our investigation, search and subscribe to Real Stories Tapes True Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts.
In 2008, an illicit message sent from inside a British prison orders the murder of a teenager in Sheffield. A supposed traitor becomes a marked man.
Same city, the year 1925, 83 years earlier, and a brutal beating leaves a man dead. It's the first gangland murder Sheffield has ever seen. It sends a shockwave through the city, earning it the title of Little Chicago.
We'll be looking at two murders, both shocking, both caused by violent gang feuds.
We'll see how a giant gambling empire split to create Sheffield's gangland.
And how that continues to this day, played out with guns in backstreet turf wars.
We'll be finding out what triggers such violence and the measures the police have taken to break the cycle of crime. Sheffield may not be the first city that comes to mind when you think of gang crime, but like many parts of the UK, the city has a history of gangs stretching back generations. At the time of the First World War, gangs in Sheffield didn't make their money from drugs or protection rackets, but from this, the game of pitch and toss. You place 3 coins on the ends of your fingers and then toss them. Tails, tails, heads. Believe it or not, betting on this became big business for the gangs of Sheffield, beginning a turf war which continues today. But what allowed a simple game of chance to take such a firm hold of the city? The slums of Sheffield in the 1920s were some of the worst in Great Britain. Even the writer George Orwell said, "This was the ugliest town in the world." 15,000 overcrowded back-to-back houses with poor shared sanitation made the city a hellhole. To the working classes without jobs, without prospects, and with very little money, there was just one pastime which provided a dim ray of hope: pitch and toss. It was illegal and controlled by gangs. Well, I've come up here to meet J.P. Bean, who's the sort of local historian, social historian, has written a book about Sheffield gang wars. And I think he's going to tell me a lot about how the early gangs began here in Sheffield, grew out of poverty, and especially a man called George Mooney. JP.
Hi, Gary.
Yeah, good to meet you. Good to meet
You too. How are you doing?
Good. So, where is it?
Up here. We're on Manor Lane Road.
Wonderful. Great graffiti.
Original Sheffield art.
JP is taking me up to the top of one of the hills overlooking the city. Today it looks more like a golf course or a playing field, but back then it was here that illegal betting took place.
This is Sky Edge, an ideal place for pitch and toss, which one of the most simple forms of gambling, but here vast sums were bet. A man called Jack White, who was a publican from Barnsley, was known to regularly bet £50 on one single toss of the coin.
Huge sum of money.
Huge sum of money. The organisers of the ring took 4 shillings in the pound as a toll. The toller ran the ring. George Mooney here was the toller. So somebody put £1 on, the pound went on the floor as the bet, 4 shillings went in George Mooney's pocket.
George Mooney became the leader of a highly profitable organisation. But all gambling outside of horse racing was illegal. Sky Edge was the perfect place.
Because it was high, they could have lookouts all the way round to warn of impending visits by the police.
I see.
They were known as pikers. Piking is a local term for looking. First sign of the police, the whistle would go up, they'd be away.
So how many men from the city would be up here, do you think, at one time?
200, 300. In the First World War, it was very, very popular.
So there was only one man tossing the coins?
The man tossing the coins was known as the tosser. Mooney was the toller, and the ponter, who was armed with a stick, kept order around the ring.
So it's very theatrical. One guy standing here, hundreds of people surrounding him, he's tossing the coins, people are shouting loudly.
Absolutely.
And people are over there looking out for the police.
And making side bets, as well as shouting loudly, on the outskirts, on the edge there, and all around.
And because Sky Edge was such a good vantage point, Mooney's men rarely got caught. And even if they did, the highest fine was only 40 shillings, when it was possible to make £40 in a day. Mooney's empire was making a fortune from miners and steel workers. But when the First World War ended, steel production ceased. Mooney's takings dropped dramatically. George Mooney wanted to keep hold of as much money as he could, so he slimmed down his operation. He got rid of all the scouts and minders, including his top henchman, Sam Garvin. This was a move that would have serious consequences.
That all rebounded upon him because Sam Garvin, who organised the Park men, the men from the Park district of Sheffield, and they became rivals of the West Bar people led by Mooney.
And what was that gang called?
The Park Brigade. They were known as the Park Brigade, and they fought back for the right to run the tossing ring, and thus began the Sheffield Gang Wars in April 1923.
The feuds between the Mooneys and the Park Brigade would push gang warfare in Sheffield to a new level of violence, earning the city the name of Little Chicago. It became the forerunner of the turf wars, which threaten the city today.
Same city nearly 100 years on, and another gang splits up, creating two opposing and violent groups locked in a bloody vendetta. The gang is called the S3, named after the postcode of the area where they live. The S3 was already a violent gang. It had an ongoing feud with the S4 gang, which led to 3 murders in 18 months. A police dossier chronicled at least 40 occasions in which the two gangs opened fire on each other. But now, a violent rift started within the S3 gang itself.
So the S3 area covers 2 districts, Pittsmore and Burngreave, splitting the S3 gang into 2 separate factions. Both sides are fighting to control their drug-selling territories. But what's more important to them is to reinforce their reputations.
To understand the makeup of this culture and this city, I've enlisted the help of Alan Macaulay, Principal Lecturer in Politics and Sociology at Sheffield's Hallam University. He's going to take me on a tour of the city.
But at the moment we're in a system of cutbacks.
Yeah, it's understanding the gangs in Sheffield is a mixture of politics, of social issues, of drug culture, also of understanding young men in the 21st century, and a lot of them feel almost bypassed. Because of that, you get distortions, whereas, if you and I fell out, we probably wouldn't talk to each other for a few weeks. We certainly wouldn't try and stab each other or ultimately shoot us. It's about, you have, in some cases, disrespected me, and in some of the cases, stabbed or defigured someone. So it's then revenge for that. And it's about a reputation that's built up both by word of mouth, but now particularly through social media, through Facebook and all the rest of it. And that is increasingly playing a role in keeping these feuds going on longer. So even in a kind of modern society, they've become isolated and have become outside the norms of Britain in the 2000s. A lot of them have friendships going back years. In fact, some of the S3 people were friends from the ages of 4 and 5, apparently then fell out over relatively trivial issues, sometimes over a small amount of drug debts, which can in some cases be as small as 50 quid.
So they're not making any money, these gangs?
No, they're disorganised criminals. They're dealing in relatively small amounts of cannabis, crack cocaine, occasionally heroin, although not very often. Their disorganisation has led to levels of violence that are probably unheard of.
A teenager in Sheffield was building his reputation in Pittsmoor S3, but he became targeted by the rival faction. It would be fatal. Around lunchtime, on Friday, July the 11th, 2008, he went into French's Barbers, which stood on the corner of Spittal Street. It was the last haircut he would ever have. Little Chicago was about to show its ugly face. Many disputes begin with a real or perceived breach of street etiquette that slights a gang member's reputation. Members are expected to defend their reps, their reputations, and the most minor incidents can escalate into feuds. In 2008, the teenager was 17 years old. Gifted, popular, and generous, he came from a respectable middle-class family. But despite his upbringing, he became drawn into the street action of the S3 area. It's alleged he had a street pitch to sell cocaine. A composer of rap music, he even boasted in one of his raps that, "I can cause more chaos than World War II." But the S3 territory that he'd like to be seen in had become divided. Tensions on his turf were running high, and now about to erupt into violence. It all started when one half of the S3 gang accused him of giving away the whereabouts of a cousin of theirs, resulting in him being knifed almost to death. They were now about to teach him a lesson. After following him for 1 week, the gang were ready to strike. In the early hours of Sunday, the 6th of July, he was ambushed outside his home. Here, he was attacked and webbed, which meant being given a stabbing, 7 times in the legs and lower body. The knife narrowly missed his organs. He managed to stagger home, and he was rushed to hospital.
Then, once he'd been treated in hospital for fairly serious injuries, I think he had a perforated liver and things like that, which was pretty bad stuff. Came out after a week, and within a day or so, he was back here in the centre of what is, the area where these gangs operate.
Just 3 days after leaving hospital, he was ready to go out and show his face again and rebuild his rep. But this time, he carried a gun for protection. He made his way back into S3 territory and headed for Spittal Street in Pittsmoor. And there was no better way to reinforce his rep than first sharpen up his haircut. French's Barbers was a popular place to hang out and be seen. He left the Barbers and was confronted by 3 hooded figures. He took out his black handgun, but raised his arm too late. He was blasted in the back from close range with a sawn-off pump-action Beretta shotgun.
So you were here the day of the murder. Can you tell me what you found when you first got in here?
Yeah, chaos really. It was completely sealed off by the police. There were officers all around this corner here. A lot of onlookers who, you know, were obviously shocked and aware that something major had happened here in broad daylight. This is the actual shop where he was when the two guys came, opened the door and essentially called him out onto the street. He came out of the shop and was shot in the back here on the street.
But when he came back here, he was holding a gun, wasn't he?
That's right, yeah. He was aware that he was marked in some way and he felt like he needed to have some manner of defending himself.
But it's kind of a brazen comment, isn't it, to say, here I am and I'm not going to be pushed away even though I've been stabbed.
I think it's the bravado that is endemic in this kind of culture, you know, amongst these kind of lads. They do not want to lose face. And I think that's, you know, his father said, I just wish he could have just let it go. But of course he couldn't, because it was about being out there. You know, he was on the internet making, you know, claims about himself, and he was well known. He was a rapper, all this kind of stuff. And he had a name on the street by that point. And of course, when you live in that culture, you have got to defend that name, I think. And that is what he was doing with the gun in his pocket.
He was defending his reputation. 80 years earlier, George Mooney was defending his gambling empire.
In the 1920s, the Mooney gang split and the Park Brigade emerged as a more ruthless bunch, led by Sam Garvin. Garvin was a bookmaker, gambler and promoter of bare-knuckle boxing matches. He had amassed a string of convictions and prison sentences for assault, illegal gaming, con tricks and larceny.
Garvin was a professional criminal, first conviction in 1904, very well connected with local politicians. When the first very decent council houses were built in Sheffield, he got one, and there weren't many of them. In the depths of the Depression, when everybody's living in poverty, he drove a 3-litre Bentley saloon.
Garvin's Park Brigade quickly ousted the Moonies and took over control of the pitch and toss. Now the Moonies were out for revenge. A series of violent tit-for-tat attacks followed.
They attacked one of the Park Brigade in his bed, a man called Bill Furness, one Saturday night in April 1923. They attacked him with hammers, severely injured him, never reported to the police, but there were reprisals. A few days later, one of the Park Brigade was coming away from here, away from the tossing ring, and was slashed with razors over 100 times. Walked down that road there, the road with the graffiti, staggered down there with his head caved in, covered in blood. 100 razor slashes found on him at the infirmary. Wouldn't speak to the police, wouldn't say who'd done it. All he'd say was, I reckon they've spoiled me suit.
I reckon they had spoiled his suit.
They had spoiled his suit.
But the vendetta between the two gangs would culminate in the most violent attack Sheffield had ever seen. It would be an innocent man, a non-gang member called William Plummer, who was going to experience just how ruthless Sam Garvin's Park Brigade could be.
So here we are, Princess Street, scene of the murder of William Plummer.
So tell me about William Plummer. Who was he? What did he do?
William Plummer was a 34-year-old Scotsman. He'd come to Sheffield after the First World War to work in the steelworks. Father of 3 children, he had no connection whatsoever with gangs.
Then how did Plummer get involved?
The night before he was murdered, there was a fight, an altercation between a man called Liversidge and Wilfred Fowler.
Fowler was?
Wilfred Fowler was one of Sam Garvin's gang. Plummer and his wife and others went along to ensure fair play in this fight between Liversidge and Fowler. Liversidge knocked Fowler to the ground and generally got the better of him. Fowler was injured Plummer helped him up, and instead of being grateful for that, Fowler said to him, "Jock, you're going to pay for this," despite the fact that he'd had nothing to do with the fight at all and he'd helped him off the ground.
I see.
So because one of his lads had been beaten, Sam Garvin was affronted. The old gangster pride or whatever, control. And Garvin rounded up a group of men. They came down here the following night, the end of April 1925, to look for Plummer. They were breathing fire, they talked of murder, they talked of blood flowing down the streets. It was clear that there was going to be trouble, serious trouble, and indeed there was trouble. Plummer came out of his house down there at number 42, walked down here to the corner, and he said, "I'll fight you one by one." They didn't want to know about that. Gangs don't work like that, do they? They all jumped upon him.
Around 20 of Garvin's men hit Plummer with pokers, koshes, a piece of lead on a string, and this vicious weapon, ironically called a life preserver, a chair leg with nails in it. Although being badly beaten, Plummer managed to crawl back to the house, but as he struggled towards the door, he was then pounded repeatedly with a child's scooter. Plummer had severe head injuries and 2 great wounds resembling bayonet thrusts through his stomach and side. He was taken to the Royal Infirmary, where he died within minutes.
There'd been slashings, there'd been shootings, there'd been bludgeonings, but he was the first man to be killed. It was the first murder of the Sheffield gang wars.
But it wouldn't be the last. The attack on William Plummer in 1925 was one of the most vicious Sheffield had ever seen. Garvin's gang of up to 20 men, including Wilfred and Lawrence Fowler, had beaten Plummer and killed him. But what of these perpetrators?
The gang dispersed. The Fowler brothers, Wilfred and Lawrence Fowler, both members of the Park Brigade of Sam Garvin's gang, they lingered. When the first police officer arrived, the Fowler brothers were sitting on the chip shop steps. Lawrence Fowler, the police officer said, "What's happened?" Lawrence Fowler said, "I hit him on the head."
He admitted it.
Well, he said, "I hit him on the head." The police officer said, "Be careful, it looks like being serious," as they were going to the police station. And Fowler said, "All right, then I didn't hit him on the head." These were not the brightest of men.
But the leader of the gang, Sam Garvin, was much sharper.
What he'd done, he'd stirred up all the violence here, and then just before it happened, just before the assault on Plummer, on the corner there, he'd hopped on a tram, got off in the Wicker in Sheffield, and assaulted the first man he saw, who just happened to be an old pal of Mooney's, so he recognised him. And thereby, effectively, gave Sam Garvin an alibi.
But this ploy didn't work. Sam Garvin was rounded up, along with 9 other suspects, including the Fowler brothers. They were taken to West Bar police station.
So we're in Sheffield Fire and Police Museum, and this is one of the sort of police cells that the Fowlers would have been brought to after the murder.
This is the old West Bar police station, only 100 yards from where George Mooney lived, right in the heart of Mooneyland. And you've got your tiles, the wooden bench on which they slept, a wooden pillow, old blankets. Many times, many gangmen would have been brought here.
In all, 10 men stood accused of murdering or aiding the murder of William Plummer, including the Fowler brothers, as well as Sam Garvin, the Park Brigade boss. This single investigation exposed the whole criminal network. It was an alarming glimpse into a lawless city. It called for urgent action. Sheffield had always had a very small police force, just 556 men to police a population of over 500,000. But now this would change because the Sheffield gangs would come under attack from two new forces. The first of these hit the streets just 4 days after William Plummer's murder. It was the Flying Squad.
The local authorities were under pressure. They'd been ignoring the issues for a couple of years. It became apparent that they were going to have to do something. The police formed a special duties squad, colloquially known as the Flying Squad. There were 4 men, all First World War veterans, all not averse to fighting, not averse to violence, took the war to the gangs.
Now Sheffield would take another swipe at the gangs. They appointed a new chief constable. He would become Britain's first gangbuster. His name was Percy Sillitoe. Aged 38, Sillitoe was an unorthodox choice. He'd left England to become a trooper in the African police, working in a tough and brutal regime which kept control over native tribes. Now, back in England, Sillitoe would apply the same methods.
He got on with the magistrates. He knew the name of every police officer in the force. He was great for building people's morale up. He backed them up to the hilt. No matter what they did, he supported them. They knew that they could go out and take war to the gangs and that the chief constable would be right behind them.
So why was this any different to the police force before? They were bigger guys.
They were bigger guys, and they went out, they went to publicans and they told them, don't serve gang members. If you serve gang members, we'll oppose your licence. If they saw gang members in the pubs, they hauled them out and battered them. There were no, there was no human rights.
So this was just another gang, really?
Effectively, they'd be fire with fire, steel with steel. Yeah.
So do we know any of these characters?
There was 6'4" Walter Loxley. Now, Walter Loxley was a bit of a local legend all his life, really, because of what happened in the gang troubles. There was a famous occasion where a defendant was in court accused of assaulting Loxley, but the defendant was far smaller than him and covered in blood and bandages and whatever. And his solicitor said to the magistrates, Your Worships, this should not be a case of assaulting the police, it should be a case of attempted suicide.
Sillitoe brought in men like PC Pat Geraghty, who stood 6'5" and could hold 7 tennis balls in one hand. Sillitoe also introduced the European Jiu-Jitsu champion Harry Hunter to train the force in self-defence. After 7 weeks, each man could deal with 60 methods of attack.
The Flying Squad threw people through windows, they threw them through doors without opening them first. They battered people in public view. They took them round the back occasionally, but they didn't take any prisoners if they didn't need to. On one occasion, they battered a guy in a pub and the landlady fainted.
This is what Sheffield police were presented with on the afternoon of July the 11th, 2008. A hooded teenager lying in a pool of blood outside a barber's shop. A handgun lying nearby.
As if to emphasise the scale of the problem, police in Sheffield said this afternoon that a 17-year-old shot dead at a barber shop yesterday was probably himself carrying a firearm.
Did the police pick up any leads or,
It was very difficult for the police. People just do not want to assist them with their inquiries. You know, they just find themselves up against a brick wall, essentially, a lot of the time. Things just close down, you know.
But then the police got a break, which changed the momentum of their inquiry. The investigation began to make progress. A shotgun was found near the barber's shop hidden in Oscarthorpe Park. It was later proved to be the murder weapon. Eventually, witnesses came forward and named the gang members. But the real breakthrough came when they discovered that one of the gang had a cousin in East Yorkshire, in the Wolds prison.
The police realised that, you know, there was some communication between this guy in prison and the guys on the outside.
how did they establish that?
I think it was essentially they started to look at cell site analysis, which is where the police check where a phone has been at a certain time, and they can then check which phone that phone is calling. So they were able to checked the phones of the guys on the outside and realised there was a pattern of calls to this particular number.
Who were the guys that were speaking?
There was a guy inside, Nigel Ramsey, who was known on the street before he was convicted and sent to prison as the General. He had a cousin outside, Denzel Ramsey. They were exchanging phone calls. Nigel Ramsey had a mobile phone inside his cell at the Wolds prison.
It's been estimated that there's a mobile phone, SIM card and phone charger for every 10 inmates across Britain. In one survey conducted in 2009, around 4,000 mobile phones and SIM cards were found. They're smuggled inside in numerous ways, in the soles of trainers like these, in milk cartons, in books, washing powder, even in food. You name it, it's been done.
How would he have got that?
It's thought that it was smuggled in on somebody or thrown over a wall and picked up.
So Nigel Ramsey, the General, sanctioned the killing.
That's right. It's thought that he decided that because of his treachery, he would have to be killed. Issued the order over his mobile phone from prison, and that was that.
In 2008, one cell at Wolds Prison in East Yorkshire was occupied by Nigel Ramsey, known as the General. He was one of the leaders of the rival S3 gang in Sheffield. Ramsey had been sent to prison for armed robbery and holding up a post office. But this didn't prevent him from organising the murder of a teenager in Sheffield. Just over 1 year after, the case came to trial at Sheffield Crown Court.
What was the atmosphere like around the trial?
It was very tense. You can feel the emotion and the animosity there. These were guys who had been part of the same gang, who had then split apart. So the tension there was palpable, really, between the two groups. There were armed police stationed outside this court building because of concerns.
After 5 days of deliberations on August 7th, 2009, a jury found 4 men guilty of murder. The judge sentenced 23-year-old Nigel Ramsey, the General, to a minimum of 35 years in prison for instigating the murder. 21-year-old Michael Chattu, who pulled the trigger, was given 30 years. 20-year-old Denzel Ramsey, 25 years. And 17-year-old Levan Menzies, 20 years. Sentencing, Mr. Justice Griffith Williams said, Britain is not broken, although certain communities are being plagued by the lawless activities of the likes of you and gangs such as the S3. I make it clear that to protect them, the full rigour of the law must be brought to bear, and rogues like you must be brought to book. 2 members of the gang laughed and joked with each other as the sentences were handed down.
They actually cheered and jeered and kind of shook their fists at the public gallery, and people in the gallery were actually shouting back down at them. It was like it was almost like a triumph. Like, well, yeah, I've got 25 years, you know, I'll do it, and like an achievement almost.
In the late 1920s, gang warfare in Sheffield had caught national attention. The murder of William Plummer had shocked the nation. Over 8,000 people attended his funeral. They were visibly protesting against the violence that was plaguing their streets.
The murder trial of William Plummer's attackers opened on Tuesday, July the 28th, 1925. 10 men stood accused of William Plummer's murder. The crucial issue was who had struck the fatal blow. The bayonet wound Plummer received had killed him, and although the bayonet was never found, Wilfred Fowler was seen jabbing Plummer with it.
There were 80 witnesses in all, 50 who'd been at the scene, another 30 of medical, forensics, whatever people. All travelled over to Leeds for 4 days, 4-day trial before Mr. Justice Finlay. And at the end of it, Wilfred and Lawrence Fowler were found guilty of murder. 3 other men were found guilty of manslaughter and got penal servitude.
It's hard to imagine because they were all involved in the beating
Yeah.
of this man, and yet only 2 of them get found guilty of murder.
A handful, literally a handful of all the witnesses said they saw Wilfred Fowler with a bayonet. Others said they'd seen Lawrence Fowler hitting Plummer with a truncheon. They were the 2 key ones in the whole melee, I guess.
After the trial, both Wilfred and Lawrence Fowler were sentenced to death by hanging. Although Sam Garvin, the leader of the Park Brigade, was not involved in Plummer's murder, he did assault a man when he tried to create his alibi, and for that he got 20 months. But what happened to his arch-rival, George Mooney?
George Mooney went to jail for biting a man's ear off on a train coming back from a race meeting.
Hungry, I guess.
Yeah. It's on an ear diet. Several of the other principals in both the old Mooney gang and the more recent Park Brigade were in jail.
So even before the Second World War started, they were all dissipated?
It was all done and dusted by 1927.
By that time, the heavy-handed tactics used by Percy Sillitoe and the flying squad quickly turned the city around. The crimes of the Mooney gang and the Park Brigade were brought to an end. Soon, newspapers were reporting success after success as Sheffield's gangs were eliminated. Many said that the flying squad were no better than the gangs themselves, but no one doubted their effectiveness. The murder of William Plummer shocked Sheffield and was a wake-up call for all police forces. It highlighted the horrific nature of gang warfare and its irrational, uncontrolled violence.
That same horror confronted the teenager's family in 2008. Our son used to have lots of friends, and his main mistake was that he trusted some of those who he should not have trusted. They handed him the death sentence, and for his family and friends, the life sentence. It's such a waste of young life, thrown away all because of dented pride. I want to find out if Sheffield is going to be able to solve this deep-rooted problem.
So tell me about the future for Sheffield.
We've certainly seen a fall-off in public gang activity since the shootings. The police have been much more high profile. There's been much more investment going on that the City Council has developed with its youth services a gang strategy, which does appear to have made a real difference. But the police have taken a much more interventionist approach. They've now been targeting individuals using warrants to arrest people and basically using much more intelligence-driven policing, I think, which has resulted in a fall-off in activity. And I think also some of the peripheral people involved in the gangs walked away at that point as well.
Yeah.
You know, the ones who began to think, well, you know, it might be him today, but it could be me tomorrow.
Over the last 8 years, 10 lives were lost in gang violence in the city. A long-running police operation targeting drug and gang crime led to more than 50 arrests, with more than 200 police officers taking part in the raids. Today in Sheffield, there's a number of new initiatives to steer young people away from gangs. One of these is called Zest for Sport.
Sheffield particularly has problems with the old postcode gangs, as they're sort of referred to, particularly the S3, S6 gangs, gangs within inner city areas of Sheffield. They are present, they do go on, however, they tend to be more serious crime, which fortunately our young people are not involved in. We're in what's called the central ward of Sheffield, just outside Sheffield city centre, which is a deprived inner city area of Sheffield. Through some of the activities that we do here at Zest, we've been successful in reducing low levels of antisocial behaviour by 50%. We work closely with the police on that.
I've experienced stuff in South Africa that can then benefit these kids. They've asked me a lot about my experiences and tried to compare gang culture, like how kids respond to sport in South Africa, how, you know, how culturally it's different. And I think that, you know, it's important for them to learn about that aspect as well, and to realise, you know, the great opportunity they have at Zest, because I've worked with gangs on the streets, I've worked in South Africa, I've worked in extreme poverty, and I've seen how much things can mean to people. And I think before that time that I told them, it was as though they'd taken off, you know, their tinted glasses and realised, oh, actually.
The centre aims to provide a base for young people to come together rather than be divided by race, culture or class. And more importantly in this city, to break down the borders that exist between different areas and territories.
We work together to break down the barriers so that young people can feel that they can leave their sort of territory areas and go into other areas and feel safe to do so. Young people like to affiliate with a group, and that can be in a positive way, and it can lead, unfortunately, to in a negative way. But I think more and more young people aren't given the opportunity that they need and that they crave. In very few communities do they have a place to go that's safe, that they can access. Unfortunately, young people are being forced to grow up very quickly, which is very difficult on them. It's a huge amount of pressure now to be a young person.
In South Africa, you're dealing with quite high-level gang crime, gang violence on the streets, and a lot of the kids that you work with are involved in that, whereas here they see it as something to go out and play around in, whereas there is something that when you come onto the streets, you're in a gang. You know, you have to choose, whereas here, kids have choices, and that's what I try and tell them. You know, I say to them, you've got education, you've got a family at home, you've got all these, you know, brilliant activities to get involved with, and still some people stand there and say, well, I want more. And I think that that's where they need educating in terms of, you know, the vast opportunities that are available to them.
In 2008, the murder was a frightening insight into a culture where carrying a knife or a gun with intent to use it had become a shocking normality. Violence is something which is learned, so it can also be unlearned. The Sheffield police now work with young offenders to break the cycle of crime by behaviour change, with great success. Violent crime in Sheffield has declined, and gun crime has fallen.